Because of the global pandemic, we're using an abundance of caution. So in this era of social distancing, I've been doing these interviews from my home outside Washington. This is where I spoke with Rita, who is the former executive director of OCA-Asian Pacific American Advocates.
So OCA, Asian Pacific American Advocates, our mission is really to empower the Asian American Pacific Islander community, both economically, culturally, and politically. And so we look at the whole spectrum of where is it that we can provide opportunities to advance the community, to make sure that everyone can pursue the job they want, the education they want, the hobbies they want, right? And so we do that through different types of programming that includes mentorship for youth. It includes internships and scholarships. We have a wonderful women's program that we offer a nice group on Facebook for folks to just talk about some of the things that they can't talk about out loud. It's a safe space for them to bring up anything.
Before moving to Washington, D.C., Rita was a middle school math teacher in Connecticut. She holds a Bachelor of Arts degree in psychology from Yale University and a Master's in Education from the University of New Haven in Connecticut. Rita's background as a Cambodian refugee motivates her to fight for Asian American rights.
In Cambodia, my parents were targeted like many other families because my father was educated and actually he worked in the government. And so we fled to the border of Cambodia from the capital. I tell people that it was an 8-month walk as refugees. And hearing the story from my parents of how they had to, just take everything, how they took my brother, my sister, and me, and really had to walk through the war-torn country. They had nothing, just struggling to make it to the border, to come to any country that would take us. That's been, I think, a reality that I remember and think about, especially in this time. And I remember even as a 5-year-old, when I was bullied at school, my mom took me aside because I pushed the other child. I was upset. I didn't know how to say anything in English to defend myself, so the only thing I could do was, I pushed back. And my mom said, "This isn't our country. They can send us back." And to grow up thinking that you don't belong because other people have made you feel that way, it's difficult, right? And that I remember and have taken with me. And during this time, when I see all the racism that has come out across the country.
So I want you to kind of talk about, this double whammy. We've got a pandemic, which is obviously stirring up these kind of racist components, but also the economic components, like suddenly everyone's struggling financially as well. If you could, just a general overview of the landscape out there and some of the issues that people are coming up against.
Sure. During this time, one of the biggest issues, of course, with the pandemic is for the Asian American community is the rise in anti-Asian hate. We saw this actually in January. So long before all of the shutdowns happened, Asian-owned businesses, restaurants in particular, started seeing a sharp drop in business. And it was well before the rest of the restaurant industry even felt it. So I know in late January and February, there was a 60 to 70% decline in business. And so businesses were already being targeted because of the misinformation that came out and the rhetoric that was being used with coronavirus being called the Chinese virus, and also, I'm not going to say the other terms because I find them pretty offensive, but the continued use of calling it Chinese virus by politicians, by the media at the time. It made a target of the Asian American community because, even though it was targeted towards China, you can't really tell what ethnicity someone who is Asian American is. Like, if I didn't tell you I was Cambodian, you wouldn't know. Most Cambodians can't even identify me as Cambodian. And I think that's been an issue because all of a sudden we had just increased discrimination from people thinking that, Chinese folks were spreading the disease or were more susceptible to the disease because of strange eating habits or hygiene habits, and also because of the likelihood of travel to Asia. And, that's been, I think, the biggest issue that doesn't always get talked about is that discrimination piece and the impact it has had on the community in terms of mental health and trauma. So there's been economic impact. I think there's been a mental health impact to the community that really needs to be addressed, and especially as schools are about to reopen. I am very concerned about the atmosphere that students are going into. We've heard some reports, even before schools went fully remote, that you had elementary kids telling each other, I don't want to play with that kid because he's Chinese. And, and it didn't matter if he was Chinese or not, but you had 6, 7, and 8-year-olds telling this to other kids.
Your organization collects hate crime data. When did that start, and what are you seeing there? Are you able to track a spike at all?
Yeah, so we've actually been tracking hate crime since the 90s, and I think as we saw things were happening in terms of our community members being verbally assaulted and physically assaulted, we actually shifted our website to collect hate incidents, because a number of the incidences that are happening don't rise to the level of a crime, or the victim will never report it. And so we wanted to make sure that we had a good understanding of what was happening. And so there's actually a collaboration of 5 advocacy organizations that are collecting hate incident reports across the country. And what we've seen is since mid-January, there have been over 2,300 cases, and they range from physical assault to verbal assault to being denied services by healthcare providers to just people being prevented from going into stores or being told that they're not welcome. So there's a huge range also in terms of who it's happening to, so from children to elderly. I think what's concerning to us is that we see that there are twice as many women reporting, and so we think that it's women, Asian women are certainly seen as an easier target, and so we're very concerned about how do we protect the community, how do we make them feel safe during this time.
I heard one report where a woman was talking about. And you could easily make the distinction that this was aimed at her race, where her car windows were like bashed in, and yet she talked about reporting it to the police, and the police were, it's vandalism, that it was discounted, and so I think the distinction, hate incidents, hate crimes, because hate crimes are really tough to prosecute, aren't they? And actually to make the case. In this case, she was saying, oh no, they just kind of said, it's just a matter of vandalism, and not that big a deal. But clearly it's a big deal if it's you on the receiving end.
Right, absolutely. And I think part of the issue is, as you said, it's really hard to prove a hate crime. So unless you get it on video, somebody is saying, calling you, go back to your country, or calling you a racist epithet, how do you prove? How do you prove it? And I think that's part of why we did switch to hate incidences, because seeing the number of reports to our community of all of a sudden verbal assault, physical assault. Where did this come from, right? So you have to be able to make that logical conclusion that there is a targeting of the Asian American community during this time.
The economic impacts of the pandemic are disproportionately affecting Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. A study by the University of California, Los Angeles focused on the pandemic's effects in California and New York. Those two states have the largest Asian American populations. Researchers found that 21% of Asians were jobless, compared with 16% of whites. One explanation: Asians frequently work in industries hit particularly hard by the pandemic, such as hospitality, retail, and other services.
So interesting. And one of the things that I don't think people think about is the digital divide, which is also a matter of concern for OCA as well.
Absolutely. During this time, we have remote work and we have remote school. And what we've seen is in the conversations about that, there's been Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are often left out of the conversation about the digital divide because there's this misconception that Asian Americans are wealthy, that they have the highest educational levels compared to other groups. But when you look at the data disaggregated across communities, you'll see that 50% of Asian Americans go to community college, for example. And so OCA actually asked community colleges when we first heard that schools were going to close. And we went and reached out to about 25 college campuses and said, can you tell us what are the needs of the students? Do they have internet access and do they have the ability to do their coursework at home? Is there anything they need? And the college presidents got back to us within a day. And the need was in the thousands to say there are across, it was like 25 campuses. It was a quick estimate of 4,000 students who did not have computers at home. And the numbers were even Asian American students and Pacific Islander students. And it was even higher for students who did not have internet access. And OCA also, we work with institutions and look at community members in the Pacific Islands. And so the need there is even greater. Entire campuses where students don't have laptops. And so we did manage to get a technology grant from the Walmart Foundation to distribute laptops. We did reach out to the telecom companies really quickly and said, tell us right now, what are your options for free and low-cost internet for students and families? And we made sure to distribute that information to the universities that we were in touch with. And the response was incredible. People were saying, this is exactly what we need, but we need to make it sustainable because this issue is not going away. It's only been opened up and made more apparent because of the pandemic.
I've heard people make comments like, thanks for bringing the virus over.
To help combat the racism Asians face, some organizations have created public service announcements, such as this one by the Ad Council.
I'm a firefighter, not a virus.
I'm a mask maker, not a virus.
I'm a nurse, not a virus.
I'm a delivery woman.
I'm a rideshare driver.
I'm a chef, a neighbor, artist,
Bus driver.
I'm a doctor.
Fight the virus. Fight the virus.
We're living at a time when humanity matters most. Even though we're physically apart, we must all come together as one.
And started online campaigns such as Wash the Hate, which enlisted celebrities to raise awareness.
Together.
Advocacy groups are also calling on the U.S. government to act. In March, OCA was one of 180 organizations that petitioned the White House to improve data collection of crimes against Asians.
OCA has proposed and drafted some legislation to create a task force that looks at anti-Asian hate and would provide recommendations for how agencies could handle it. It's actually modeled after something that President Obama had formed back in 2014. There was an Asian anti-bullying task force, and that was formed when we saw a number of incidences where, I think in Philadelphia, in a single day, about 30 Asian American students were assaulted and sent to the hospital. And after that incident, the administration at that time said, there's an issue here. They started collecting data across the country and found that Asian American students were bullied based on race more than any other ethnic group in school. And so we know this has been an issue for a while. And that's why during this time, we point to these points in history to say, this is an ongoing problem. It's exacerbated by the pandemic, and we need to think about how to address it now. It is our job to watch what is happening, to note it so that we know what we have to address and correct. We can't just, let things slide. We can't give up. We have to understand that if we don't fight, if we don't take action now, then it will be worse.
So talk to me about the mental health piece and how you've tried to address that, because clearly that's something your organization has to address because it's a big part of what's going on right now, right?
Absolutely. We're seeing a lot of discussion about depression, especially amongst our youth and our elders. There's already been trauma from the pandemic due to social isolation, but then you add the discrimination piece on top of it. And we have bullying that's happening even though people are socially distant, physically distant. We see bullying on social media. And I know there was an investigation fairly recently for 2 suicides of college students that happened where, the administrator said they found that the students were being bullied due to the pandemic and due to their ethnicity. And so, it's real, the impact of discrimination. And I want everyone to make sure they understand that. It's not about, your feelings being hurt and just letting it slide. When it gets in your head that you don't belong and that, you're not welcome in this country, it has lasting consequences.
You're older, you're tough, you're resilient, you're a mom. All those things help you kind of navigate the world that we live in today. But you've got 2 kids. One's a teenager, the other one's 6 years old. What are the conversations you have with them? Because it's so much tougher. And as you mentioned, social media can be devastating. Somebody taking you out on social media and having it spread and all of that sort of thing. What do you say to them?
So I tell my daughter and I tell other young people the same thing, which is when people are bullying you, it has to do with their own insecurity. They're trying to do it because they need to feel confident about themselves. And they're trying to take you down because if they can make you feel less than them, then it makes them feel better. So that's an insecurity problem on them. And then I turn around and I say, but I want you to look at who you are and where you come from. For my daughter, I tell her, you come from a lineage of warriors. You come from Cambodian refugees who walked 8 months, the same distance from Washington, D.C. to New York City by foot, dodging bullets, evading landmines, right? That's your background. That's your history. You carry that with you, that pride of who you really are. And I tell people there's something about your background everybody has that you can be proud of and that you should remember when people are trying to sling these hurtful words at you.
Well, that's a great place to leave it. Rita, thanks so much. Keep up the good fight.
Definitely. Thank you.